My goodness, so many known faces. So let me see if anyone has any question or anything to say. First here and then there.
Oh, I was just more curious about your meeting with the indigenous elders in
Yeah.
Moab, Utah. Is that
Yeah.
something that's open to the public that happens annually, or what was it about?
No, this meeting was not open to the public, and it was a one-time meeting. It may happen again. I would love it if it happens again. But what happened? Just to give a little background, I've been associated for a number of years with a organization called the Global Peace Initiative of Women, GPIW, and they have a website where they talk about their activities and so forth. And so since 2008, they've been inviting me. They've taken me all over the world from many different countries, including exotic America. And and so they organized. They do. The reason for inviting me to places, they do other things that I'm not a part of course, but they invited me to so many countries and meetings because they do a lot of interspiritual work. And so they were the ones who invited me to Northern California back this last October to a Buddhist retreat, Ratnaling. And one of the things that they do, one of several things, they've had Hindu-Muslim dialogue. They've had the bringing the Dharma traditions together, that is Hinduism, Buddhism, Sikhism, Jainism. And so this particular event in Moab, Utah was for a dialogue between the Dharma traditions and the Native American traditions. That is, we had Hindu and Buddhist representatives, not Sikhs or Jains, but Hindu and Buddhist representatives to speak with the Native elders. And part of it was in conjunction with the visibility that the Native elders gained through the Standing Rock protests. And so we weren't there to protest or anything, but we wanted to give support to the Native American elders. And also, as it developed, again, the Native American way is not to make plans and follow schedules and things. They showed up, and we tried in the first session to discuss a little bit about agenda, but then we quickly gave up even the idea of planning out an agenda on the spot and just let things happen as they happen. So it really was a chance for us to make contact, us meaning the Dharma traditions, Hindus and Buddhists, to make contact with the Native elders. So we had a good friend of mine, Greg Snyder, who's the Zen teacher and founder of the Brooklyn Zen Center. We had Judy Leaf, Acharya Judy Leaf, who's a Tibetan Buddhist teacher, a long-term Tibetan Buddhist teacher. Swamini Swatma Vidyananda, who's from India, but she's lived for many years and taught in America. A wonderful person. And several others. And then I didn't count them, but about 15 Native American elders. So we had from the Ute Nation and from the Hopi Nation, from the Zuni Pueblo, from the Otomi, from the Old Homi, from the, I don't even know what her nation is called, but a woman from Saskatchewan, Canada, who came down. And so it was a wonderful time. People ask me, well, what did you discuss? Well, because there was no agenda, it's hard to say this is what we discussed, because the people spoke about what they wanted to. And there wasn't also in tune with the native. The idea was to allow the natives to be native, to be themselves, and to speak for themselves without imposing anything on them and without trying to impose order on them. So they did that. And so I learned a lot and spoke with a lot of them, made wonderful heart-to-heart contact with many of them. But I can't really tell you, well, this is what we discussed, because each one sort of spoke for themselves.
So what's your bottom line takeaway after it was all done?
It was wonderful. There was also one who I liked very much, and I hope to continue close contact with, Mendahi. He's a native person from Mexico, and he's from, I forget the name, I think it's Old Homi. but it's a community that is closely related to the Maya. But they were pre-Mayan, but they still continue as a separate identity. But it was sort of out of them that the Mayan civilization came. So he was there, and then a woman from Chile, who was from I didn't even know that in Chile they had much of a native population. Because of course South America, there are very strong native populations in several countries, but then some like Argentina, they're practically gone. Though even in Argentina, in the mountains, there are native people. And in Chile, in the north of Chile, her people are from there. And so she was there, and she's become an expert on the Mayan calendar. And she's discovered many things about the Mayan calendar, how it works, which many scholars have gotten wrong. And she can show it all mathematically. It's extraordinary. And when she starts talking, everybody is just stunned, because she can talk about the cycles of Venus and all of the mathematical processes and everything, and how the three different cycles of the Mayan calendar work together, and what they're based on, where they came from, why the year didn't actually end in 2012, as most people were saying. It ended in 2013, and the cycle, and a new one starts. And so anyway, there were all sorts of things. And that she was just one person who talked about calendar things. And there were the Hopi who talked about the desecration of their land and the continued the mining of uranium and leaving uranium trailings all over the place, and so many things. So I can't even begin to summarize what it was. It was just a wonderful experience. Yes.
We learn about the free will and try to grasp the concept of the will, which is free will. But where does the willpower fit in that idea? Is there something like willpower? If there is no will, there is no willpower.
No, of course there is willpower, but that willpower is not ultimately free. We have a sense of free will, and that's what allows us to work. And so we can't act without a sense of free will. It was because you had a sense of free will that you thought, well, let me go into the library and sit and participate in the question and answers. It's because you have a sense of free will that you thought about it and decided, well, let me ask a question. And so it's that sense of free will that allows us to act. But again, if you examine a particular action based on free will, you'll find that there are all sorts of reasons why you decided to ask a question. And so our idea of free will is that there's just a blank slate. I could do anything, but out of that, for freedom to do anything at all, I freely, without anything directing my choice, I freely decide I'm going to ask a question now. But no, there are all sorts of things that were within you, mainly within you in this case, that were directing you to ask a question. All of your thoughts that were going on and your past ways of interacting with people and all of that. So again, what is the will? That's an interesting question. What is the will itself? The will is connected in Vedantic psychology, Hindu psychology, with what the highest faculty of the mind, which is called the buddhi. And again, it's not that Sanskrit names are important, it's just that we don't have a name specifically for that. We translate it as intellect, but that's a very poor translation, even though Swami Vivekananda himself used that. But that's because we don't have a better word. But the buddhi is the highest part of the mind, that which has clear knowledge, that which determines, say if I saw you just a little while ago and I recognize your face immediately, that was the buddhi which made which said this is a recognized face. Then you told me that, oh, you met me in Washington, D.C. And then that was a further thing. Then the buddhi says, yes, I met him in Washington, D.C. Now the buddhi is that which gives definite, clear knowledge. It's the manas which thinks about things. Well, where have I seen him before? I've seen him somewhere. I don't know where I've seen. And then suddenly the knowledge flashes. I saw him in Washington, D.C. Then I remember you. So the buddhi is the highest part of the mind which makes definite knowledge. The intuitive part of the mind also, where we know something. Well, let me just finish this and now I'll come to you. So the buddhi has several aspects to it. One aspect is the ability to... The buddhi is where the consciousness of the real self, the Atman, that which I am, the divine self, that divine awareness is reflected in the buddhi. And it's from there that it comes through the rest of the mind and into the body and out of the senses. And that's why am conscious of you here. It's because of that being filtered through all of my faculties. But it starts in the buddhi. And so the will is the power to focus awareness in a particular direction. I'm going to do this. Now I'm going to focus it this way, and then my efforts follow in that way. So the will can be considered one of the powers of the buddhi, the highest faculty of mind, to focus attention in a particular direction. And let me say one more thing about the will, and then I'll come to you. The will, we often say that, oh, so-and-so has such a strong willpower, he gets up every morning at 5 o'clock and everything. Now, that may be willpower, but often it's just that they have a very strong habit. And habit and willpower are not the same. Willpower is that which can do in spite of habits. And habits, that's why it's good to have good habits, because that just, things happen automatically. I always get up at, I'm not talking personally, but say a person says, well, I always get up at 5 o'clock in the morning, that's just my habit. And people say, oh, you've got so much willpower. Well, no, it's just because it's a habit and he just does it. But will is that which you consciously decide to do by focusing your attention on it. And so maybe you get up every morning at 5, and then you say, no, tomorrow I'm going to get up at 3. And you put all of your attention on that, and you say, I'm going to get up without an alarm clock. I'm going to get up at 3. And then suddenly you find yourself waking up, and you're looking at the clock and saying it's 3 o'clock. Oh, it worked. Well, that's because you had focused your attention on it, and the biorhythms gave you a sense of time and woke you up right at the right time. So that directing of your consciousness towards that end, which was not habitual, that was willpower. Yes?
I think while I was listening to your lecture, one of the things that came to me was that our predispositions.
Yes.
I feel like that's where we really don't have any control over those predispositions. But then I thought about, what about some of those predispositions to fear certain things in our physical lives? Should we also face those beasts, or should we remain in that, or be careful with those fears, maybe because they were there for some reason?
Well, that's a good question. Well, let me first say, and it's a complex question. It's not a one-word answer question, but let me work with it a little bit. There's some fears that we have because they're just sensible. For instance, if you're alone and in a dangerous city, you don't walk out at midnight by yourself and wander around places that you know are dangerous. So that's a fear that you have to respect. There are other fears that are irrational. For instance, and those we should work against, we should try to get over them. And if it's a small thing, you don't need to bother about it, just to forget about it, let it be, and maybe it'll go by itself. But if it's a fear which is controlling part of your life, then you don't want to just let it go. You want to face it. For instance, I knew a woman from Maryland who had a tremendous fear from her girlhood, the small girlhood, a tremendous fear of fish. She was terrified of fish. She couldn't go into the fish department of a supermarket. It would scare her to death. She couldn't go to an aquarium. She couldn't see a little aquarium with little fish. Fish scared her to death, and her parents said they were Jewish parents who ran a laundromat. They didn't have fish in the washing machines. They said they have no idea. She never had any traumatic experience of fish or something. I would say, and she also said, that she was sure that it had come from a previous life. But that's a hypothesis. Can't prove it. But that's one way of explaining it, satisfactory to some, not to others. But the fact was that she was scared to death of fish, and by the time she was about 17 or 18, she realized that there's so many places I can't go. She couldn't even go into a museum where there are mounted skeletons of fish. That was like the Smithsonian. She was from Baltimore, and it was easy to go into Washington, D.C. and go to the Smithsonian, scared to death. And she actually would have panic attacks seeing a fish of any size or any type, or dead or alive, didn't matter. On television, in cartoons, whatever, fish were terrifying. So she decided, this is ridiculous, I've got to get over it. So she had a friend take her to the Smithsonian Museum and take her into the place where fish were displayed. That is, dead fish, but they were displayed. Some recreations and some skeletons of fish and things. So she would cover her eyes and a friend would lead her in by the elbow into the room, and then she would open just a little bit so she could see just a little speck of a fish somewhere. And she would in that way, day after day, keep going until she could open more and more and more, see a little bit more of the fish, desensitizing herself until she was able finally to walk in with open eyes. And then after that, she could go to supermarkets and everywhere. What had scared her to death before, now she was free of it because she had desensitized herself. She knew that it was irrational. She knew that a dead fish is not going to eat her. But it was not a rational fear. It was something that, again, who knows what it came from, but something she brought into this life. So that's an extreme example. But if you have fears that are affecting your life, then it's good to face them. So first decide, is it a rational fear that I should be afraid of this because it's actual a danger to me and I should be careful? In that case, you're just being sensible. Or is it an irrational fear? And if it's irrational, then face it. And then there's some fears that we think are rational, but actually if we examine them, we find that, no, I've got a very exaggerated fear. Things are not that dangerous as I thought they were. And so that also you can desensitize yourself to. So just you have to exercise a little, and finally, just to repeat what I said, in the final case of little tiny things that are not really important, just let them go and see if they disappear of themselves. But as long as they're not hurting your life, forget about them. Yes.
Yes, I'm sure
Ted.
it means let go and let God. But when you began your talk today saying that surrender is the path of grace, and then you didn't speak.
Yes, I didn't speak about grace. Yes. So that's a good thing. Yes, I did mention that surrender means the path of grace. So that the idea of grace comes both in the path of devotion, of course, because all religions where there's the belief in God, there's a belief that God is the embodiment of grace, but it also comes in the impersonal path of knowledge. So I'll explain how. So first of all, what is grace? What does grace mean? Grace means that which is freely given. Now, if I do a practice, say like I repeat a mantra a number of times, and I feel that this mantra has such power that God has to come to me, then there's no grace involved. God has become a slave of the mantra. That's why great saints, including Sri Ramakrishna and Swami Vivekananda, said, don't think that God has to dance just because you repeat a mantra. He doesn't. You repeat your mantra because it's good for you, and it purifies the mind. But the action comes from God. And so grace means that which is freely given, which didn't have to be given. So if God is like a vending machine where you put in a coin, meaning your prayer, punch the button and God has to deliver, then there's no grace involved. So spiritual life is a life of grace because the divine being, whether personal or impersonal, is ultimate freedom. There's no coercion that can be exerted on that. Our part is to purify the mind and the heart and to open it to that. As Sri Ramakrishna said, the breeze of God's grace is always flowing. So all you have to do is unfurl your sail and catch it. That is that breeze of freedom, God's freedom, is constantly blowing, but our part is self-effort. And again, it's not, turning God into a vending machine, but it means that you unfurl your sail, and then the grace which is always present, that will eventually catch in the sail. But that will catch according to God's free gift. So whether one attains to God, the beloved, or whether one attains to the infinite self, the infinite knowledge, the impersonal reality, conscious awareness, it's infinite awareness itself, when that realization is attained, God or the self or the impersonal reality, it's experienced as the gift of freedom, that nothing I could have done would ever merit this. Meister Eckhart said that when one attains to God, the great German mystic, Christian mystic of the 13th and 14th century, he said that when I attain to God, I attain something so great that nothing I could have ever done in my life, in this life or any life, would have merited it. And so that's the experience of grace. There's small experiences of graces, the grace that we have in our ordinary life, where something happens and we feel that something else was to happen and yet it didn't happen. and we give credit to the grace of God, because that freedom of God and the grace is not separate from this world. It's here also, and it happens in little ways as well. But those are predictable just because that's the nature of grace. It's not a vending machine. It is free gift. And so in the impersonal path, one feels that this is the grace of the infinite, the grace of my own self, my own higher self. What does that mean? It means that I, the individual, am making an effort. I want to realize the self. I want to know the self. Again, say I'm on the path of knowledge, the path of non-dual knowledge. I want to realize the self. And so I struggle and struggle and struggle. But eventually the truth has to be accounted for, that nothing the limited can do can acquire the infinite. The limited can't attain to the infinite. And so all I can do is, again, raise my sail in the words of Sri Ramakrishna. All I can do is practice, do the best that I can. But illumination comes from the other side. That is where the ego is obliterated. So what I try to do is to weaken the ego, not in the wrong way, because there are many teachers who try to crush disciples' egos, and that doesn't work. The ego comes out in a perverse way. So you try to do it by unselfishness, becoming more and more unselfish, and clarifying the mind, purifying the mind and the heart, and so forth, until a point comes where the ego is soft enough and clear enough that the infinite can come in and invade it and take it over. But that happens from the side of the infinite. It doesn't happen from the side of the ego. And so whether one is seeking God, the person, or the self, the infinite, that which I am, really am, but have forgotten, either way, it comes from the side of the infinite, not from the side of the individual. The problem with grace is, grace is free gift, and because it's free gift, we can't predict it. And so if we just sit around, well, I'm going to wait for God's grace, I'm just going to sit here and wait and not do anything, then it may be 1,000,000 years and 200,000 lifetimes before that comes. So what if we want freedom, if we want enlightenment, if we want God, or however we think of the infinite, then let me do what I can do, and then leave the rest to God. Why? Because I can't do anything else. There's nothing else I can do. But I can do what's within my power. And then grace comes.
If one gets to the enlightenment, what does that have to do with Jivan Mukti?
That is Jivan Mukti. Jivan Mukti means freedom of the living, freedom while living. So Jivan Mukti means one attains enlightenment while one is still alive in the body, in this world.
That is enlightenment.
That is enlightenment,
Why
yes.
They say that enlightenment is some sense of, everything is just myself, and there is nothing other than that. I mean, it seems so much larger than...
That is Jivan Mukti. Jivan Mukti comes when one realizes, and that is what you're saying, is speaking from the path of knowledge. It can be approached from the path of devotion, where the language and is different. But in the path of knowledge, Jivan Mukti comes when I realize that I am the reality. I'm one with the reality. Not Swami Atmarupananda, but that within me which is I am, that sense of identity. I realize I misplaced it and thought it was this individual, but I am the infinite. So let me go to Maureen, and I heard people over here. I'll go to Maureen because I saw her first, and then I'll come over here. Okay, Maureen?
I just heard it said that the very fact that we have a conscious awareness that moves us out of the programming of who we are, I get up the habits, the limited beliefs that we have, that this conscious awareness is actually a moment of grace. And that moves us out of this limited sense of the ego, so I wondered if you would comment on that.
That also is something I wanted to talk a little bit about, and that is that there's the idea in Vedanta that between every two thoughts, the light of the infinite self, which is freedom, which is grace, which is enlightenment, which is everything, between every two thoughts within each one of us, that light is shining through. But our thoughts are so confused, and our thoughts are so fast and so random and everything that we don't see it. We're not. The mind is not subtle enough to see it. But a time comes when actually the mind becomes subtle enough to begin to see that. But even now, it's true that even now that light of freedom is coming into our lives, and that's what keeps us from being machines. Otherwise, as I said, if all of your decisions are actually determined by a complex amount of factors, there's no freedom there. But the freedom is there because this sense of freedom is coming and is constantly impinging on your life, and giving us the sense that in the midst of all of this, somehow I'm still free. And that is true, and it's a true intuition. And so sometimes in the midst of our life, those flashes of freedom, that flash of grace and so forth, that changes the course of our lives. And so that's why many people have said, many spiritual people have said, the very decision to pursue a spiritual life, that itself is a moment of grace. It's that which is constantly reminding you that this is not the end of life. Your ordinary life is not the end of things. At some point in life, in this life or another life, that idea comes that no, I want something else. I want something which is beyond just all of this, in some sense. Different systems will explain what it is differently, or talk about it differently, but something that just ordinary life is not enough. And so that itself is from the light of grace which is constantly coming into your life. So the big grace is when you've attained to the infinite, and then everything else is blown away. But there are little graces all along the way. And that's why, say with in 12-step programs, and we'll say the original 12-step program, Alcoholics Anonymous, that many people who have been through Alcoholics Anonymous who bottomed out. They've found that they had come to a point where their life was so destructive, so self-destructive, that they wanted to kill themselves. And then they had a sudden moment of grace. And then they realized, no, there's something to live for, and they began to rise up. And so those moments of grace are coming all of the time. Sometimes it's an extreme experience like that, bottoming out in life, where the mind can't do anything else but somehow surrender, and a light comes to it and begins to pick the person up. But these moments of grace are what keep us from being machines, which keep giving us the possibility to rise, and give us the possibility eventually to know, I want to lead a spiritual life. So yes.
Yeah, there are three questions I have. You said the grace of God is also considered as one has to be a deserving candidate in order to have that kind of grace, is number one. Then you said willpower. Willpower can also be said as a self-discipline.
Okay, well, let me, instead of going through all three, let me begin with the first. That I said only the deserving person attains to grace. Well, that's not quite true, because again, as I said, as Meister Eckhart said, once you attain to the grace of God, and you attain to the realization, enlightenment, attain to the vision of God, whatever, you realize that nothing I ever did could have merited this. So you're, in that sense, there's nothing the ego can do. All you can do is self-purification and preparation. But actually you find that there's some people who attain to illumination very quickly with little preparation, and there are others who, after long years of severe discipline, they don't attain to anything. And so one way of explaining that is past life efforts, but that's a hypothesis. But no, you can't exactly say that one person is deserving and another person is not deserving, because then it's not grace. Again, it becomes a vending machine. But all that we can do is to try to make ourselves ready for grace. That's from our side.
Self-improvement.
Yes. And then the second question was what? And then I'll go to other questions.
Willpower, can that be described as self-discipline?
Well, again, that it can partially, but self-discipline also, oftentimes is just the formation of good habits, and the habits take over. And so that's not the exercise of willpower, but just the operation of habits, habitual action. And so willpower is always that where we're actually where we're exerting ourselves to do something. And habits are, it doesn't mean that habits are bad. Good habits are good. That's why we try to form good habits, because then we don't have to exert in that area. Things just go on automatically, and we can attend to other things. But that is not itself willpower. It may be the result of having exercised willpower before to form the good habit, but then habits take over. So that we have to make that distinction. There was one other thing I wanted to say about willpower when it came up before, and what was that? Willpower is the focusing of consciousness. I had it in mind a few minutes ago. Now that is gone. It may come back anyway. There's one other thing about willpower. Okay.
Third one, we are talking about the fear, panic mode. Now, when a person is bipolar, sometimes they communicate with their will, bad spirit. What is the improvements can be done there?
Well, yes. Well, that for something like that, then one really needs to have psychological intervention for that, and that one needs to have professional help. I'm not a psychologist or psychiatrist, so that I never pretend to be able to help someone with that.
Spiritual side, what can...
On the spiritual side, first take care of that through medication or whatever, or a person who has it, let them take care of it through medication or whatever, so that that's under control, and then they can certainly go forward with spiritual life. But spiritual life is built on top of sort of a point of normality, of normal normality. And what modern psychology considers normal is a broad spectrum of rough terrain. But somehow to get to what's basically socially acceptable, and then on top of that you can build spiritual things. But we shouldn't expect spiritual advice to in itself to take care of mental trauma and psychotic breaks and so forth. A lot of spiritual teachers have done harm to people by acting as though they could cure somebody with a severe psychological problem, when actually they needed some professional help, and then the spiritual teacher could have given them something to help on top of that. But we all of us in life, wherever we are and whatever we do in interacting with others, we have to know our limitations and our abilities and limitations, and not to take on. It's like Swamis like myself. If I start giving people marriage advice, then you are foolish to listen to me. I can read all sorts. Yes, I can read all sorts of books about marriage counseling and all of that, and I can get a degree in marriage counseling, but without having experienced it, what am I going to say? Mine is all theoretical knowledge, and so I can give sometimes spiritual advice which helps a married couple because it was what they needed, but to think that I understand the dynamics between husband and wife and all of that, or between parents and children, that's assuming much too much. So we have to know our limitations and say, I can teach you what I can teach you, what I've experienced and what I've lived and what I've tried for in my spiritual life. But things that are outside of my experience, it's extraordinary egotistic assumption to say that, okay, now I'm going to fix your marriage problems or your problems with your children and so forth. Okay, Caroline, and then Mark, and then Dr. Roy.
Swami, a little bit more on the subject of grace, which I find fascinating. If there's nothing we can do to make it happen, other than to become spiritually more in tune and to practice and meditate and that kind of thing, is it possible to have grace visited on us and not realize it? I mean, is that a silly question?
No, it's not a silly question. It is possible because, as I said, first let me say, and then I'll come to what I was going to say. First, let me say that if grace is visited upon us, then even if we don't recognize it, it does its work. It doesn't matter that we didn't recognize it. It's already done what it was to do. We can't, grace can't be visited upon us and we're ignorant of it and therefore we lose the opportunity. No, it does what it does. But as I said, the fact that something turns us towards spiritual life, spiritual interest. At some point in our life, suddenly we feel that this isn't enough, I want something more, where can I find it? And we find out that, well, no, I want to, something in me says that a spiritual life is what I need. That itself is a experience of grace. I may not recognize it as a experience of grace. I may think that, well, just my life was a mess, or I was unhappy, or I felt I had so many things and I still wasn't happy, and then I realized that this is what I need. That was the experience of grace, even if I don't recognize it. and it did its work even if I don't recognize it. I still turn towards spiritual life. And, Dr. Roy, yes. Yes.
Maharaj, two things. One is that we can understand through the Jnana Marga, through the pathway of knowledge, we can understand the self, and we can say Aham Brahmasmi.
Yes, I am Brahman, yes.
But without the grace of God, which is, as I understand, comes from the complete surrender to Lord, can you get the Jivan Mukti even if you understand that Aham Brahmasmi or Tattvasi?
Yes. No, good question. Now, the bhaktas, that is, devotees, they will say that if you realize the self, the impersonal self, that I am the reality, I am the one self of the universe, I am Brahman, that was because of the grace of the Lord. And jnanis will say to a bhakta that if you attain to the realization of God, that was because of the grace of your own self. And so actually the two are talking about the same thing. So the jnani, yes, can realize Aham Brahmasmi without even thinking about God. They don't need to go through God. And so to say that, well, it was actually through the grace of God, that's adding something in that to the jnani is meaningless. And it doesn't... Buddha denied the existence of God, and yet he was an enlightened being. He attained to Jivan Mukti. So the devotee, the bhakta, the devotee of God, the one following the personal path, has one way of understanding the self, the individual self, the nature of the universe, the nature of God, the spiritual path, and that works within that framework. The jnani has a different approach, and that works within that framework. Both lead to the realization of the infinite, but the path leading to them are different, and you can't project from one into the other. They have commonalities along the way also, because they're both dealing with human nature and the nature of reality, but they're different ways of looking. And so that's why the bhakta thinks in terms of surrender to God and to the beloved, and let me love God, let me worship God. And the jnani thinks in terms of let me identify with the self. I am the self. Aham Brahmasmi. I am the reality itself. Let me try to realize that. And so the two as paths, they appear very different. They go towards the same place, but they go in different ways. To the jnani, they may see everything as the operations of karma. To the bhakta, they may see everything that happens in their life as the will of God. It's like light, physical light, which in some experiments has the nature of a wave, and other experiments show it to have the nature of particles. Particles and waves can't be the same. A particle and a wave are two completely different modes, and yet light shows both. It's a contradiction. And yet you can look at light one way where it's a particle, another way you can look at it and it's a wave. Both work in different situations. So jnana and bhakti also. So we shouldn't think that, well, the jnani actually is getting where he's getting on because of the grace of God. No, that's not part of the jnani's path. So to the bhakta, as Sri Ramakrishna said, to the devotee worships God, seeks God. And if the devotee wants to realize the infinite, their identity with Brahman, then they pray to God for that. As Sri Ramakrishna said, and as many have said, that the Divine Mother holds the key to Brahmajnana, to the knowledge of Brahman. And so one way to attain to the impersonal, to the identification with the infinite, is to worship the personal God, in this case the Divine Mother, but any way you think of God, to worship the personal God, praying for the attainment of the infinite knowledge. And then God is experienced that it's through God's grace that is unlocked. Because in that way of thinking, that way of experience, not just a way of thinking, it's not just conceptual, it's an actual way of experience. God holds the key to Brahmajnana. But the jnani, the one following the path of knowledge, goes straight to the impersonal without thinking about God and God's action. So Mark, you had to...
Oh, you talked about the mantra, and you warned against us treating the mantra like a slot
Like
machine,
magic, yeah.
Like magic.
Yeah.
Well, actually, that's exactly where I was going. I wonder if there's a tension between what I see as a magical approach and some of the teachings that I've come across in Vedanta about the magic nature of words, like bijan, these.
Yeah.
That some people will know what that means. So I'm wondering, is there a tension between your approach and the approach that I've heard from others about these magic words that seem to me to fit pretty neatly in with that machine analogy?
Yes, there is a tension, but they often exist within the same person, because speaking specifically of the mantra, and you could use other examples also, like ritual worship and things like that. But speaking specifically of the mantra, and realizing that this could apply to other types of practices as well, the mantra has extraordinary power. The mantra is empowered by a teacher and through a lineage of teachers. And the mantra has within it the grace of God. And by repeating it, if you have faith in it, if you have faith in the power of the mantra, then the effect of the mantra is itself enhanced. And so, a teacher will tell you that the mantra is not just a word, it's not just a string of sounds, not just a random string of sounds, which is objectively true. It's not just a string of sounds, it's not just some word. It's a word that is imbued with the spiritual power by a tradition and a succession of teachers, including the teacher that gives the mantra. And so, in order to enhance the faith of the disciple, the teachers talk about the greatness of the mantra. They're not lying, they're talking about something which is true. But at the same time, and that's why there's a tension. So your question is good. At the same time, there is a tension because even a mantra is not like a magic button that you punch it and then God dances for you. That doesn't happen. So you practice the mantra, and you can practice it for decades, and you may not feel. You may feel something after some years of practice. It may be decades after decades. You feel that I don't even know if anything has happened. Something has happened because the mantra has its own power. But the fulfillment of it comes from the other side still. Not because God has to reveal himself because you've repeated a mantra, but the power of the mantra makes it a powerful way of purifying the mind. But even then, that's what it's doing, is purifying the mind, purifying the heart, making the mind and heart receptive to God. But then still, there's both your own karma, which slows down the process, plus the grace of God, which has to come of its own.
So do you think that part of that tension could be reconciled by just the level of sophistication of the term magic? That some people might think of magic as being like a vaudeville trick, and other people might think of magic in a more sophisticated way as just some sort of power that we don't understand. Is that a fair way?
That's a fair way. And I would make a distinction and say that it's not magic, but it depends on always how you define the terms. What you're saying is a good way of defining it. What I would say is to define magic as that which is automatic because it's just an automatic process. You punch the button and you get the delivery of the good. And what you're calling the higher magic, which is legitimate, but I would say that that's the power of grace, the power of the mantra, and so forth. Because there's again, however you define the terms, there's an important difference between magic processes and spiritual processes. Because a magic process is something that you do it, you pronounce the formula, you draw the geometric diagram and everything, and then the forces of nature or forces of God or whatever have to perform. But God isn't like that. God isn't the slave of God or the self is infinite freedom and isn't the slave of anything
See, I
like
think
that.
that's very important because, at least as I understand the history of religion, it grew out of a sense of magic in this sense that you're talking about, where if I didn't sacrifice the animal to the sun god, the sun wouldn't come up.
Yeah.
And I think to this day, people that are religious are bedeviled by those beginnings because you have sophisticated secular people who look at someone who describes himself or herself as religious, and they're thinking, oh my God, this guy believes that he has to sacrifice the goat.
Yeah.
And that's I think a less sophisticated approach, certainly.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, no, that's a good way of putting it.
How would miracle play with that versus magic?
Miracle is, miracle is also a complicated issue because the different things are called miracles. Most of what are called miracles, as Swami Vivekananda explains, are actually explainable by higher laws. We call something a miracle because it's not explainable by the operations of nature as we understand them. But a person who has, who has lived in a forest without any contact with modern civilization, if they suddenly are brought to a television and shown things on television, it looks like magic. And so it's just because they don't understand and they haven't seen the development of things up to the point where you can make a television and broadcast images from a distance and so forth. And so the same with even things like clairaudience, clairvoyance, and telepathy and things like that. Those are actually following higher laws. They're not miracles. It's just that we don't understand how to do it. But a person who does understand how to do it, to them it's natural. So what is natural is dependent on what we understand. A real miracle is something which is an actor. The only real miracle is grace, and that is that which comes from the realm of freedom, which is completely outside the realm of law. Anything within law is not a miracle. It just looks that way because we don't have any idea how it happened. Okay.
Walking on the water, is it a miracle?
No, that's not at all a miracle. That's just someone that in the yoga texts in India it was explained how to do different types of pranayama and so forth, so you could develop the power to walk on water. That's why that bumper sticker. And if you think you're perfect, then try walking on water. Well, that's ridiculous. Jesus was not God because he could walk on water. There are yogis who can do that. So Jesus was God because he was able to free, at his very wish, liberate people, give them enlightenment by his very wish. Yes.
It's a question which can be easily misunderstood because I'm from India.
Yes.
I have that natural bias on good or bad side both. And being in America for over 40 years, it does something to you.
Yes.
I'm trying to be very careful in choosing words.
Yes.
I don't want to walk into where I'm going.
Yes.
That my main question is, what has India to do with it? But let me explain what I'm trying to say. Yoga came from India, and what I see in America is a lot more beautiful twist to it, ugly twist to it, but in the way it's marketed, packaged, there's so many people benefiting. If I go to India, then there are 50 times, and I don't see the people, average person, like here average person, don't connect with it in that depth, in that beauty where it was born. Same thing with tea. It was born in India or came from India, but British and American package it better. So, if I was in a typical setting like this in India, except Belur Mat, I'll take that to the side.
Yes.
I won't see this sense, this spirituality or that. Since you are neutral, you have an international outlook, what do you think India has to do with all this?
That's a good question, a legitimate question. I would say, based on my own experience, I've lived in India, not like you're living here, but I've lived in India over 12 years of my life. Not this time, but over a couple of periods. I've lived more than 12 years in India. And in India, there is because of the thousands of years of development, there is a spirituality that's sort of there in the atmosphere, but in tune with what you're saying. Most people today don't benefit from it because they're not interested in it. Most people today are interested in material development and other things. Swami Vivekananda thought that was a necessary period for India to go through. He thought it was also a dangerous period because he didn't want India to lose its spiritual moorings. But after 1,000 years of being subjugated, then suddenly a country which was basically on the feudal model as far as so the social system goes, suddenly it was thrust into the modern world. Europe, the Americas, they were not that, historically speaking, not that long ago, they were also feudal societies. By the time, of course, the Europeans came to America, the feudalism was ending in Europe already, so feudalism was not brought here. But our feudal past is not very far behind us. Yet, we had several centuries to grow step by step out of feudalism into what's the modern age. And and so India was suddenly thrust from the feudal age into the modern age without any preparation and without asking to be thrust. And so that caused huge upset in India. And now suddenly you see that people are fascinated with modern science, with technology, with engineering, with the possibilities of economic development and material development and everything, and the satisfaction of material desires and all of that. And so much of the energy of the country has gone in that direction. And yet, for those who are sensitive, when you go to India, you still feel in the atmosphere that there is something there. And that is still accessible to those who want it, even if most of the people in India right now are not interested. Swami Vivekananda, as I was saying, he thought that India needed to go through a period of material advancement and material development so that it again could come back to its spiritual roots. And again, he recognized the danger in that because, as you said, in India, I go around India in different places and speak, and I find that people mainly just want to be reassured of traditional things. And if I talk about spiritual practice and things, people are not so interested. If I tell them that, the scriptures are great and the rishis were great, then they feel happy. And so what you say is true. But my feeling is, based on both observation and reading of Swami Vivekananda, is that that's a temporary stage in India. One other thing, let me say, which is not directly in answer to your question, but it's sort of a tangential relationship. One of the things that I've seen is that again, what I'm going to say is based on a belief in reincarnation. So those who don't believe in reincarnation, just, Swami's crazy. But this is based on the belief in reincarnation. What I've seen over the last 47, 48 years of my involvement with being a member of the Ramakrishna mission and meeting many, many people east and west, is that in the 20th century, especially the second half of the 20th century and into the 21st century, there's a great exchange of ideals going on, so that you see many Westerners who are more Indian than many Indians, and you see many Indians who are more Western than many Westerners. And so my own belief is that there's been this great exchange of ideals through the people perhaps who are from the East who are reborn in America and people from the West reborn in India, and this exchange of ideals. So as I see it, that in the long term is healthy. But in the short term, it means that India has been swayed from its ancient roots, at least apparently. But Swami Vivekananda believed, and I believe, that those roots are so deep that that won't go on for long. That those roots will pull the culture back. Once people, as Swamiji said, if people don't have a chance to satisfy their desires, the desire for renunciation itself doesn't come. So there's a place for the satisfaction of material desires, worldly desires, and so forth. When people say that, well, I can have it, or I have had it, and that's not enough, then they come to the idea that, no, I want something more. And so India needed to pass through a stage where enjoyment was a possibility, because that was denied in India for a long time under subjection and so forth.
That's a great interpretation. I hope you write about it. So we hang on.
Thank you. Let me just say, I'll take you. No, I'll take you. You continue in just a moment. I'll say this. Let this be the last question because we're already over time, and so you or not a question or comment, whatever it is.
It jives with, was it Maslow's?
Oh,
yeah,
that.
You can't get to the point of intellectual or spiritual until your basic needs of materialism and security is satisfied. So
Exactly.
it's right in line with your expression there. It's beautiful.
Yeah. Oh, good. And that's why. Yeah. And Maslow's ideas were very good on that. Yes. What was it called?
Hierarchy of needs.
A hierarchy of needs. The hierarchy was the word I couldn't get. Yes, hierarchy of needs. So yes, no, that's true.
And even psychology talks about the ego needs to be developed in order to transcend it.
Exactly. Yes, and that's so. Let me just comment on that. That's a very good point because I mentioned it in the talk, and so let me end on that note for now. And that is that I've seen many teachers who have the idea of teaching, meaning let me crush my disciples' egos, and that I've rarely seen that to work. A person who's very mature and very advanced, it might work, but for the ordinary people. The ego is not crushable, as Sri Ramakrishna said. Sri Ramakrishna used to say, don't think in terms of destruction of the ego, think in terms of maturing the ego. He said that it's the unripe ego that we don't want, it's the ripe ego that we want. So you don't go from unripe ego to no ego, you go from unripe ego to a matured ego. And if you try to destroy the ego, you find that it doesn't destroy, it comes out in perverse ways. And so that we have to be very careful. And so in the modern marketplace of spiritual ideas, buyer beware is the basic principle. So with that, it's very, very good to see you.